It started with a knock on the door and ended in a frozen prison far from home. Under Stalin's rule, millions vanished into the Soviet Union's most feared system, the Gulag. After the 1917 Russian Revolution, Lenin and the Bolsheviks took power and promised a new future. But the country was falling apart. The old Russian Empire had collapsed. A brutal civil war broke out between the Red Army and the anti-communist White forces. Cities were starving. Villages were destroyed. Millions of people were displaced. Chaos was everywhere. To hold on to power, Lenin created a brutal solution: the Cheka, a secret police force led by Felix Dzerzhinsky. Their job was to find and destroy anyone who disagreed with the new Soviet government. People could be arrested for being counter-revolutionaries, or just for speaking out. Many were executed without trial. Others were sent to makeshift labor camps in remote parts of Russia, including Siberia, the Urals, and the Arctic North. By 1918, these camps had started to grow. They were called forced labor camps and were run by the state. At first, they were used mostly for political prisoners and captured enemies from the Civil War. But soon, common criminals, religious leaders, and even homeless people were added. These early camps were disorganized, brutal, and deadly. Prisoners worked long hours, cutting trees, building roads, or digging mines, often without proper tools, food, or clothing. In the early 1920s, the Soviet government saw how useful forced labor could be. Labor camps were now seen not just as a punishment, but as a way to fuel the economy. They started organizing them more carefully. In 1923, the first major camp system was created in the Solovetsky Islands in the White Sea. The camp was called Slon and held around 10,000 prisoners. This camp would later become a model for future camps. When Joseph Stalin came into power after Lenin's death in 1924, he saw an opportunity. Stalin wanted complete control over the economy, the countryside, and the people. He didn't just continue the camp system, he expanded it into a massive tool of state terror. In 1930, Stalin signed an order turning the loose network of labor camps into an official system called the Gulag, short for Glavno Upravlenie Lagery, or Main Camp Administration. It was now part of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. This meant the camps were not just for criminals, but for anyone seen as a threat to Stalin's power. That same year, over 100,000 people were already imprisoned in these camps. Most were not murderers or thieves. They were peasants, many who had refused to give up their land to the state. These people were labeled enemies of the people and shipped off to labor camps in freezing forests, deserts, or remote mountain valleys. There were no rights, no appeals, no escape. But this was just the beginning. What came next would turn fear into a daily part of Soviet life. In the early 1930s, Stalin introduced one of the most destructive policies in Soviet history: collectivization. His goal was to take land, animals, and tools away from individual farmers and place everything under state-run collective farms. It was supposed to modernize agriculture and increase food production, but for the people who worked the land, it was a disaster. Millions of peasants, especially those who owned even a little more than their neighbors, were branded kulaks. This word used to simply mean wealthy peasant, but Stalin changed his meaning. Now a kulak was anyone who resisted government control. That could mean refusing to hand over grain, hiding a cow, or even just being related to someone who did. Between 1930 and 1933, Stalin launched a brutal campaign to eliminate the kulaks as a class. Around 1.8 million people were targeted. Roughly 400,000 were arrested and sent directly to the gulags. The rest, over 1 million, were exiled to remote areas of Siberia, Kazakhstan, and the far north. These weren't organized settlements. They were frozen wastelands. People arrived with no housing, no food, and no tools. Thousands froze to death before shelters were even built. One of the largest deportation sites was in Tomsk Oblast. where thousands of families were dumped near the Ob River with nothing. In Nazino Island, over 6,000 people were left without supplies, and within weeks, over 4,000 had died. Some accounts from local officials report cannibalism. These places weren't called camps, but they became death zones. Meanwhile, inside the actual Gulag camps, the conditions were no better. Food rations were often less than 800 calories a day, not enough to survive heavy labor. Bread was rationed based on work performance. If you couldn't finish your task, you got less food for the next day. Clothing was torn or missing altogether. Many prisoners didn't even have gloves or boots in sub-zero weather. Temperatures in Siberia could drop to below -40 degrees Celsius, especially in camps like Ukhta and Vorkuta. Prisoners were ordered to build roads, fell trees, dig canals, and construct railways in these freezing temperatures. They used hand tools or no tools at all, and if they slowed down, they were beaten. If they collapsed, they were left in the snow. Diseases like typhus, dysentery, and pneumonia spread quickly. Medical care was almost non-existent. Most prisoners were simply thrown into isolation huts where they were left to die. The dead were buried in mass graves, or sometimes not at all, just dumped into pits in the frozen ground. By 1933, the official Gulag population had passed 400,000, but that number only told part of the story. Millions more had been sent into exile zones or died in transport. Trains carrying prisoners often lacked food or heat, and many didn't survive the journey. This wasn't just punishment, it was a purge. And soon, Stalin would turn his fury toward the very people who helped him rise. Between 1936 and 1938, Joseph Stalin unleashed one of the most terrifying crackdowns in Soviet history, the Great Purge. It was no longer about silencing dissent in the countryside. Anyone with influence, education, or an independent voice became a potential enemy. Teachers were accused of spreading counter-revolutionary ideas. Doctors were labeled as saboteurs. Engineers were blamed for factory failures. Army officers, even war heroes, were arrested on charges of treason. Writers, poets, and intellectuals were accused of ideological deviation. And shockingly, even Stalin's old allies, men who had once fought beside him in the revolution, were dragged into courtrooms and publicly condemned. Fear gripped every level of society. At night, the dreaded knock came. Black NKVD vehicles, known as Black Mariahs, would appear without warning. People were pulled from their beds, blindfolded, and taken away. Families were given no explanation, no answers, and often no return. Children woke up to find their parents gone. Those arrested were often tortured into giving false confessions. A simple accusation could mean death. No evidence needed. Interrogators broke bodies and minds, demanding names, forcing prisoners to implicate others. This created a spiraling web of arrests that fed itself. Show trials were staged in Moscow, broadcast across the country to justify the purge. The verdicts were predetermined. The charges were absurd, and the sentences, almost always death or hard labor, were carried out swiftly. Some prisoners were shot in underground prisons hours after sentencing. Others were packed onto overcrowded trains and sent north to the labor camps of Siberia and the Arctic. Over the course of 2 years, more than 1.5 million people were arrested. At least 700,000 were executed, most with a single gunshot to the head, carried out in secret basements or remote forest clearings. The remaining hundreds of thousands were dumped into the Gulag system. By 1938, the Gulags were overflowing. Over 685,000 prisoners toiled in freezing forests, mountains, and swamps. They dug canals by hand, blasted tunnels through solid rock, mined gold, and cut timber in brutal conditions. Food was scarce, shelter was basic, disease spread fast. Thousands froze to death, collapsed from exhaustion, or simply vanished into the wilderness. The system was growing, and the worst was yet to come. Every project Stalin envisioned, no matter how impossible or dangerous, was built on the backs of those imprisoned. One of the first was the White Sea-Baltic Canal, completed in 1933. It stretched 227 kilometers, connecting the White Sea to the Baltic Sea, and was dug entirely by hand. No bulldozers, no cranes, just tens of thousands of prisoners with primitive tools. They worked up to 20 hours a day through ice and mud while barely being fed. Official Soviet records claimed 25,000 deaths, but survivors and later investigations suggest the real death toll may have been twice as high. Bodies dumped into unmarked graves or buried within the canal walls themselves. Next came the Moscow-Volga Canal, another massive project aimed at reshaping Soviet infrastructure. Between 1932 and 1937, nearly 200,000 Gulag prisoners were forced to dig it out. They hacked through frozen ground, hauling soil in wheelbarrows, while frostbitten hands bled through their gloves, if they had gloves at all. Many collapsed from exhaustion and were never seen again. Others drowned when the canal walls failed. There were no breaks, even in the dead of winter. Deaths weren't recorded. They were simply replaced with new prisoners. Further east, the scale of forced labor became even more brutal. In the Kolyma region of Siberia, prisoners worked in gold mines under conditions so harsh that the name Kolyma became synonymous with death. Temperatures dropped below minus 50 degrees Celsius. Men broke ice with picks, wearing thin coats and worn-out boots. The prisoners dug their own graves with every shovel of frozen earth. Survival often depended on bribes, luck, or simply being assigned to a slightly less lethal task. In the forests of Karelia and Irkutsk, prisoners chopped timber for Soviet industry. Some were assigned to logging camps so deep in the wilderness that they didn't even appear on maps. They lived in wooden barracks without insulation, often sleeping beside rats and lice, and were beaten for slowing down. Starvation was constant. Many died with axes still in their hands. Mining camps added another layer of horror. In the uranium mines of the Ural Mountains, men inhaled radioactive dust every day. They had no protective gear. Some started vomiting blood after just a few weeks. Most of them were dead within a year. In copper and coal mines across Kazakhstan and the Far East, prisoners worked underground in toxic air, their skin burning from chemical exposure, their lungs choking with soot. Stalin's state reaped massive profits from this slave labor. Timber, gold, coal, copper, uranium, all extracted through suffering. The finished canals and factories were paraded as signs of Soviet progress. The propaganda praised heroic workers for their sacrifice. But the reality was hidden. These workers were prisoners, sentenced for nothing or for made-up crimes, dying in silence to build monuments for a regime that never saw them as human. And it was far from over. As new industrial projects began, Stalin's machine only grew hungrier. In 1939, he made a shocking move by signing a secret non-aggression pact with Hitler, known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Just days later, the Soviet Union invaded eastern Poland, carving up the country alongside Nazi Germany. Almost overnight, hundreds of thousands of Polish civilians found themselves under Soviet rule. The NKVD moved fast. Between late 1939 and mid-1941, over 1.5 million Poles were deported to Siberia, Kazakhstan, and other remote Soviet regions. More than 100,000 of those were sent directly to the gulags. They weren't soldiers or criminals. They were school teachers, priests, professors, doctors, writers, civil servants. Stalin viewed anyone with influence, education, or national pride as a danger to Soviet control. Arrests were often arbitrary. Entire families were ripped from their homes at night, loaded onto cattle cars, and transported in freezing, unsanitary conditions for weeks. Once in the gulags, conditions were brutal. Polish prisoners were treated with suspicion and hostility. Many died within months due to malnutrition, forced labor, exposure, and disease. Others were interrogated and shot by the NKVD in secret mass executions, like the infamous Katyn massacre in 1940, where over 22,000 Polish officers and intelligentsia were executed. But the fragile alliance between Hitler and Stalin didn't last. In June 1941, Hitler betrayed Stalin by launching Operation Barbarossa, a massive military invasion of the Soviet Union. The Red Army was caught off guard. Entire Soviet divisions were wiped out, and millions of civilians fled or were captured. The USSR plunged into chaos. Yet Stalin didn't ease up on Gulag inmates. He saw them as traitors, saboteurs, or potential spies. Even as the Nazis advanced deep into Soviet territory, prisoners were not released. They were weaponized. Thousands were transferred closer to the front lines to dig anti-tank ditches, construct makeshift roads, and mine coal for the war effort. Many of them were also forced to work without proper tools or warm clothing. In some regions, the prisoners died faster than they could be replaced. In 1942 alone, over 350,000 Gulag inmates died. Starvation rations, overwork, and freezing temperatures turned labor camps into death factories. Food was reduced to 300 grams of bread per day for many, while work demands increased. Escape was nearly impossible. Guards were ordered to shoot on sight. Anyone who survived desertion often froze in the wilderness or was captured and tortured. During the war, the repression expanded further. Soviet women, especially those with foreign connections or from annexed regions like the Baltic, were accused of espionage. Some were ethnic Germans, Japanese, or even Soviet citizens married to foreigners. Many were imprisoned without charges and subjected to forced labor in textile plants, construction brigades, or harsh agricultural camps. Reports of sexual violence, psychological abuse, and fatal exhaustion were widespread. Despite the Allied victory in 1945, life inside the gulags didn't improve. In fact, peace only made things worse. Stalin saw new threats everywhere, and the gulags would soon overflow with even more bodies. People were arrested for almost anything: speaking to foreigners, listening to BBC radio, making jokes about the government, or even just being seen as politically unreliable. No trial, no evidence, just a knock at the door in the middle of the night. Between 1945 and 1950, over 2 million people were swept into the Gulag network. The camps were filled with war veterans, refugees, factory workers, and random civilians. Stalin was building roads, railways, and new industrial zones, all powered by slave labor. In 1947, he passed a brutal new law that criminalized petty theft. Stealing a loaf of bread, a coat, or a few potatoes during a famine could now get someone 5 to 10 years in a labor camp. Desperation wasn't a defense. Even children were punished. Kids as young as 12 were rounded up and sent to juvenile gulags. Some had stolen food just to survive. Others were simply homeless or orphaned by the war. And instead of being helped, they were locked up and forced to work. One victim of this era was Alexander Dolgun, an American who worked at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. In 1948, he was arrested without warning. Accused of being a spy, he was thrown into the Gulag system for 8 years. He endured starvation, savage beatings, psychological torture, and solitary confinement, all without ever seeing a courtroom. Then there was Fyodor Mochulsky, not a prisoner, but a camp guard. In his memoir, he confessed that even as part of the system, what he witnessed broke him. Men and women collapsing on the job, pleading for food scraps, dying from exhaustion. Bodies were dumped into mass graves every day. But Stalin's shadow couldn't stretch forever. In March 1953, he died after suffering a massive stroke. His sudden death left the Soviet Union in a state of uncertainty and quiet relief. Power began shifting quickly behind closed doors. Within weeks, arrests slowed, executions stopped, and the vast machinery of the Gulag began to stall. Nikita Khrushchev soon emerged as the new leader. Though he had been part of Stalin's inner circle, Khrushchev wanted to distance himself from the worst of the regime. In 1956, during a closed session of the Communist Party Congress, he delivered a shocking speech. He openly condemned Stalin's cult of personality and the brutal repressions that had defined his reign. The speech wasn't meant for the public, but its impact spread fast, inside the USSR and beyond. What followed was a wave of reforms. Thousands of political prisoners were released from the Gulag. Men and women who had vanished behind barbed wire for decades walked free, confused, aged, and often with nowhere to go. Some had spent 15 or even 20 years in the camps, convicted without evidence. A few were rehabilitated on paper, their names cleared quietly. Most just tried to rebuild what little life they had left, but no release could undo the past. Millions were dead from cold, hunger, overwork, or execution. Others survived but were broken. Families were destroyed. Entire generations grew up without fathers or mothers, without answers. Some people returned to find their homes gone and their identities erased. Siberia, once seen as a place of exile, had become a silent graveyard. Forests, valleys, and frozen plains were filled with unmarked mass graves. There were no tombstones, no ceremonies, just bones beneath the snow, left to history. Even those who served the system weren't spared from its collapse. Some former guards were arrested under new investigations. Others kept quiet, hoping their roles would be forgotten. And many simply tried to bury the memories, just like the bodies they had once watched over. It's hard to know the exact number, but historians estimate that over 18 million people passed through the Gulag system between 1930 and 1953. And at least 1.7 million died. Some think the true number is even higher. These weren't just numbers. They were parents, siblings, friends, doctors, artists, poets, and farmers. There were people like Varlam Shalamov, who wrote about eating rats to survive, or Lev Razgon, who spent years in freezing cells unsure if he'd ever see his wife again. The gulags destroyed not just bodies, but minds, families, and communities. And the fear they created lasted for generations.